I'm not a pessimist, I'm just a realist. How many times have you heard that? Maybe you've even said it yourself. It sounds reasonable, like a badge of wisdom, a way to justify always expecting the worst. But here is the question. Is that actually true? Or is it just a sophisticated way of rationalizing negativity? The biggest lie pessimism tells us is that it's objective. That seeing the worst in people, assuming failure, or doubting success is simply realism. But pessimism isn't about seeing reality clearly. It's about filtering reality through a lens of fear, disappointment, and past wounds. And worst of all, it creates the very outcomes it fears. This is the paradox. Pessimism feels like a safeguard. If you expect the worst, you'll never be disappointed, right? But in reality, this mindset doesn't protect you, it limits you. It drains motivation, kills opportunity, and subtly pushes you toward failure, proving itself right in the process. So, the real question isn't whether pessimism is realistic, it's whether it's useful. Nobody is born a pessimist. We don't come into this world expecting failure, betrayal, or disappointment. Pessimism is learned before it is chosen. It's the result of repeated experiences that teach the brain one simple rule: the world is not safe. According to trauma expert Gabor Mate, our early environment shapes not just our emotions, but our very physiology. A child who grows up in unpredictability, whether through neglect, harsh criticism, or emotional instability, doesn't develop trust in life. Instead, they develop defensiveness. They learn that expecting the worst is the safest bet. Childhood is where our internal narratives begin to form. A child who is constantly criticized may stop believing in their own abilities. One who grows up with emotionally unavailable parents may internalize the idea that relationships lead to pain. And if disappointment becomes a pattern, the brain adapts. Hope is dangerous, expecting nothing is safer. This isn't a conscious choice, it's survival. The nervous system wires itself to anticipate threats, not because it wants to, but because it had to. Beyond personal experience, there's the impact of role models. Growing up around bitter, defeated, or fearful adults instills a worldview of limitation. If a parent constantly complains about how life is unfair, how success is a matter of luck, or how nothing ever works out, the child absorbs it like a sponge. They learn pessimism not as an opinion, but as truth. And as they grow, that truth starts to shape their own actions, expectations, and ultimately, their outcomes. Cognitive biases, mental shortcuts that shape perception, begin forming early as well. One of the strongest in pessimists is confirmation bias, the tendency to see only the evidence that supports one's beliefs. If you expect people to betray you, you'll notice every small act of selfishness while ignoring the acts of kindness. If you assume your efforts will fail, you'll focus on every obstacle while disregarding potential solutions. This is how pessimism self-replicates. It filters reality in a way that continuously proves itself right. So, while many pessimists believe they've seen too much to be optimistic, the truth is that they're not reacting to reality itself. They're reacting to a version of reality shaped by their past. And unless that filter is recognized for what it is, it becomes a self-imposed prison, one where expecting the worst guarantees it. Pessimism isn't just psychological, it's biological. The brain is hardwired to prioritize threats over opportunities, pain over pleasure, and failure over success. This is known as negativity bias, an evolutionary adaptation designed to keep us alive. However, this doesn't mean we are born pessimists. Rather, our brain makes it easy to adopt pessimistic thinking. For our ancestors, survival depended on being hyper-aware of dangers. Missing a potential reward wasn't a big deal. Missing a predator was. So, the brain developed a tendency to focus on what could go wrong rather than what could go right. The problem? In the modern world, where existential threats are rare, this instinct doesn't protect us. It traps us in unnecessary fear. This bias feeds directly into catastrophizing, the tendency to take a single setback and spiral into worst-case scenarios. A rejection isn't just a rejection, it's proof that no one will ever love me. A failed project isn't just a failed project, it's evidence that I'm doomed to fail forever. This mental distortion turns temporary discomfort into existential despair. It convinces the mind that one event defines an entire future, when in reality, setbacks are just that, setbacks. But to a brain wired for negativity, they feel like forewarning of doom. Then comes the illusion of control. Many pessimists believe that by expecting the worst, they are preparing for it. It gives them a false sense of readiness, as if being cynical somehow prevents bad things from happening. But does it? Studies suggest the opposite. Constantly anticipating failure doesn't make you more prepared. It makes you more anxious, less resilient, and more likely to avoid risks altogether. Pessimism doesn't prevent disaster. It guarantees stagnation. By convincing yourself that failure is inevitable, you don't just expect it, you ensure it. So, while pessimists often claim they're just being realistic, what they're really doing is surrendering to a biological bias without questioning it. They let an outdated survival instinct dictate their mindset, not realizing that in a world where opportunities define success more than threats define survival, their wiring is working against them. The real question isn't whether bad things will happen, they will. The question is whether living in a constant state of pessimism actually helps deal with them. Many pessimists don't just accept their worldview, they take pride in it. They wear their negativity like a badge of intellectual superiority, believing that optimism is naive, and that only those who see the world through a dark lens are truly enlightened. This mindset provides a perverse sense of validation. If you assume everything will fail, you're never disappointed, only proven right. Pessimism, in this sense, is less about realism and more about ego. It's a way to feel wiser than those who still dare to hope. Few thinkers embodied this philosophy more than Arthur Schopenhauer and Emile Cioran. Schopenhauer, often called the philosopher of pessimism, saw life as an endless cycle of suffering, driven by blind, meaningless will. He believed happiness was an illusion, and that the only escape from suffering was detachment. Cioran, on the other hand, made pessimism personal. His mother once told him that if she had known how miserable he would become, she would have aborted him. That comment seemed to shape his entire outlook on life. He took pleasure in despair, famously saying, "Without the possibility of suicide, I would have killed myself a long time ago." Yet, in an ironic twist, when he developed Alzheimer's late in life, he reportedly forgot his existential misery, raising the question of whether his suffering was truly inherent or just a construct of his own making. Beyond philosophy, pessimism hides a powerful psychological indulgence, the thrill of saying, "I told you so." When things go wrong, the pessimist gets to bask in the satisfaction of having predicted disaster. It reinforces their worldview, making them feel superior to those who dared to believe in a better outcome. But what happens when things don't go wrong? The pessimist simply moves the goalpost, convinced that failure is just delayed, not avoided. This mindset ensures that no amount of success, progress, or good fortune can ever disprove their negativity. The real reason pessimism is so comfortable is that it justifies inaction. Optimism, contrary to popular belief, is not about blind faith, it's about effort. To believe in a better future means taking responsibility for making it happen. It requires action, risk, and resilience. Pessimism, on the other hand, demands nothing. If failure is inevitable, why even try? It allows people to sit back, criticize, and avoid the burden of striving for something greater. It is, in many ways, the laziest philosophy, one that takes no courage, no initiative, and no accountability. In the end, the true challenge isn't to predict failure, it's to build something despite it. That's why optimism is harder than despair. It's easy to surrender, to call everything meaningless, to scoff at those who still believe in progress. What's difficult is standing up, embracing uncertainty, and choosing to create, even in the face of potential failure. The question isn't whether the world is imperfect, because of course it is. The question is, whether you use that as an excuse to do nothing or as motivation to do something. Pessimism isn't just a worldview, it's a shield. If you expect failure, you never have to risk disappointment. You never have to try too hard, commit fully, or put yourself in a position where real effort is required. This is the trap. By assuming the worst, you give yourself an excuse to hold back. You don't push yourself because it wouldn't have worked anyway. But in reality, it's not the world stopping you. It's your own fear of what happens if you actually succeed. Self-sabotage plays a huge role in this cycle. When someone deep down believes they are destined to fail, they will unconsciously make choices that ensure it. Missing deadlines, procrastinating, choosing the wrong people to associate with, these aren't just random bad habits. They're ways to confirm the negative beliefs already ingrained in the mind. If things go wrong, at least it's expected. If they go right, it threatens the identity of someone who has built their entire psychological framework around the idea that they can't win. But here's the real kicker. For many people, success is actually scarier than failure. When you're used to losing, there's a strange comfort in it. It's predictable. But winning, that comes with expectations. If you do well, you'll have to maintain it. If people start to see you as competent, they'll expect more from you. And what if you can't keep up? What if you achieve something and then lose it? That fear can make people choose stagnation over growth, not because they don't want more, but because they're terrified of not being able to handle it. This is why a lot of intelligent, capable people underachieve. Not because they lack skill or opportunity, but because failure feels safer than expectation. When you expect little from yourself, there's no pressure. No one is watching. No one is waiting for you to prove yourself. But the avoidance of expectations is just another form of self-imposed limitation. Pessimism might feel like protection, but in the long run, it's just a prison. Chronic pessimism isn't just a mindset. It's a weight that drags a person into deeper emotional suffering. When someone constantly expects the worst, they aren't just predicting failure. They're living it over and over before it even happens. This mental rehearsal of disappointment creates a cycle where the brain becomes conditioned to associate life with inevitable letdowns. Over time, this fuels anxiety, the fear that things will always go wrong, and depression, the belief that nothing will ever get better. The result? A person who feels trapped in their own mind, unable to see a way out. The brain adapts to whatever patterns it's exposed to most frequently. If you constantly tell yourself that life is pointless, that people will betray you, or that success is out of reach, your brain wires itself around these thoughts. This is how negative thought loops are formed. You don't even need external confirmation anymore. Your mind supplies its own evidence by filtering out anything that contradicts your pessimism. A compliment? Must be fake. A small win? Just luck. This is the real danger. Pessimism stops being a conscious choice and becomes the default setting of your reality. A perfect fictional example of this mindset is Rust Cohle from True Detective. He embodies the archetype of the intellectual pessimist, someone who has turned despair into an identity. His philosophy is pure nihilism. Time is a flat circle, meaning everything repeats endlessly, and there is no escape from suffering. While Cohle is brilliant, his intelligence only deepens his suffering because he intellectualizes his pessimism, making it seem rational rather than destructive. Many people fall into this trap, believing their bleak worldview is a sign of wisdom, when in reality, it's a coping mechanism that shields them from hope, and therefore, from the vulnerability of trying. This is why breaking the cycle of pessimism is so difficult. It's not just about changing thoughts, it's about confronting personal responsibility. Pessimism, for all its misery, offers a strange form of comfort. It removes the burden of accountability. The hardest truth for a pessimist to accept is that their suffering is, to some degree, self-inflicted. Letting go of pessimism means admitting that they could have tried harder, they could have made different choices, and that the world isn't entirely against them. But confronting this truth is the first step toward escaping the mental prison of negativity. Because, as I said, pessimism doesn't just predict failure, it ensures it. Pessimism is also often a response to pain. When life hits hard, whether through loss, failure, or betrayal, it's easy to see pessimism as a form of emotional armor. If you expect the worst, you can't be blindsided, right? It's a way to protect yourself from more disappointment. And honestly, that makes sense. If you've been through real suffering, telling yourself to just think positive feels insulting. But the real issue with pessimism isn't that it's unrealistic. It's that it traps you in a mindset that stops you from ever moving forward. Breaking out of it requires cognitive restructuring, a psychological technique that involves challenging negative thoughts. Instead of assuming failure, ask yourself, what evidence do I actually have that things will go wrong? Is it just fear, or is there a real pattern? Often, pessimistic thinking is automatic and unchallenged. It feels true because it's familiar, but just because you've thought something 1,000 times doesn't mean it's reality. Learning to reframe these thoughts without forcing fake positivity can slowly shift your default response to life. Another key step is recognizing the power of small wins. A lot of pessimists think in absolutes. If I'm not completely successful, it doesn't count. This kind of thinking fuels pessimism because life doesn't work that way. Growth happens in increments. Proving to yourself that good things can happen, even on a small scale, slowly rewires the brain away from expecting the worst. Whether it's sticking to a small habit, finishing a project, or handling a difficult conversation well, every win, no matter how small, is a counter-argument against the idea that life is hopeless. The real challenge is replacing nihilism with meaningful struggle. Pessimism is easy because it doesn't require action, it justifies inaction. But what if you chose to fight for something instead? What if you allowed yourself to believe, just for a moment, that things could work out? And the final question to consider is this: what if everything doesn't go wrong? What if, despite your fears, life actually turns out better than you expect? Because if you never let yourself entertain that possibility, you might never give yourself the chance to experience it.